All right, are we ready to get started? I'm Abby Jordan. I'm the Secretary for the Federalist Society. On behalf of President Megan Green and my fellow executives, and also on behalf of Patrick and Campbell Law's MILSA Chapter Military Student Association, pardon me. Thank you for joining us today. And to the members of MILSA that are here and to any veterans that may be with us, thank you so much for your service. Thank you also to Dean Leonard and to the administration for making this event possible. And thank you for joining us. I hope we get some stragglers. Before we get started and related to today's topic, I'd like to remind our students that as you're tweaking your spring schedule, make sure to look for the immigration reform course that's going to be offered this spring. I know Dean Leonard has worked very hard to bring Campbell Law alum George Miller to our school. He's been teaching the course for several years at Charlotte, and we're excited to have him join us in the spring. So immigration law course, check it out on web access. Now for the main event. I am thrilled to welcome our guest, Attorney Ilya Shapiro. Mr. Shapiro is a senior fellow in constitutional studies at the Cato Institute and an editor-in-chief of the Cato Supreme Court Review. Before joining Cato, he was a special assistant and advisor to the multinational force in Iraq on rule of law issues, and he practiced international, political, commercial, and antitrust litigation. Before entering the private practice, Mr. Shapiro clerked for Judge E. Grady Jolly of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. He holds an A.B. from Princeton University, a Master of Science from the London School of Economics, and a J.D. from the University of Chicago Law School, where he became a Tony Patino Fellow. Mr. Shapiro is the co-author of a book that was just released last week, so go get it on Amazon. It's Religious Liberties for Corporations, Hobby Lobby, the Affordable Care Act, and the Constitution. He has contributed to a variety of academic, popular, and professional publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, USA Today, and the National Law Review. And he also regularly provides commentary for various media outlets, including CNN, Fox News, ABC, CBS, NBC, all the major ones, and the Colbert Report, most importantly. Mr. Shapiro has provided testimony to Congress, and as coordinator of Cato's amicus brief program, he's filed more than 100 friend of the court briefs in the Supreme Court. He lectures regularly on behalf of the Federalist Society and other groups. He was an inaugural Washington Fellow at the National Review Institute, and he has been an adjunct professor at the George Washington University Law School. We are extremely excited to have him speaking with you today on immigration reform. Just as a reminder, any views that Mr. Shapiro gives you are not the views of the Federalist Society or of MILSA. They are his own. Please enjoy. Welcome, Mr. Shapiro.
Thanks very much for having me. I appreciate everyone here. I know, having been a law student not too long ago myself, that you're primarily here for this delicious food. Free food is great when you're a student. Well, it's great anytime, I suppose. Secondarily, to ingratiate yourselves with the dean and the professors in the audience, and I'm sort of the afterthought, the dining entertainment, but that's just fine. This topic is unique in my repertoire in that I've never studied, taken a class in immigration law, never practiced immigration law. I've sort of come at it autodidactically because I'm an immigrant. I'm a double immigrant, actually. I was born in Russia, and we came over to Canada when I was little. Kind of took a wrong turn at the St. Lawrence Seaway, so I became a naturalized Canadian. And then I enjoyed immigrating so much, decided to do it again. Finally, after a lot of twists and turns, and kind of illustrating the absurdities in our system, I finally became a U.S. citizen just this past June. And like most immigrants, I do a job that native-born Americans won't. That's defending the Constitution. All right, so you're welcome to ask me about my own personal journey. There's a lot of just weird absurdities that you wouldn't believe I wouldn't believe if I had gone through it myself. So when we think about immigration and how it's so screwed up, the title of my talk is "Why the Immigration System is the Worst Part of the the government and how to reform it? Well, it's really Congress's fault. Everybody knows that our system is a mess, and this is quite a statement. I know what I'm saying, particularly coming from someone at Cato, a libertarian think tank that finds a lot to critique in the government, and especially from a constitutional lawyer who's spent a lot of time over the last number of years enmeshed in the Obamacare litigation, and now, of course, the Supreme Court took another Obamacare case, among other monstrosities that have been foisted on the American people in the last recent years. But it's true. Far from merely advancing bad policy, our current immigration system lacks a coherent policy that it purports to implement in the first place. Our immigration system is a remnant of various half-baked reforms going back decades. It's a schizophrenic set of laws that don't advance any particular goal or mission. If you tried to put together a set of procedures for how foreigners enter a country, how long they can stay, and what they can do while they're here, it will be hard to come up with something less efficient or effective than our current hodgepodge of often conflicting regulations. This immigration non-policy has led to a state of affairs that serves nobody's interests. Not big business or small business, not the rich or the poor, not the most or least educated, not the economy or national security, and certainly not the average taxpayer, except perhaps immigration lawyers and bureaucrats who make a living explaining and figuring out this morass. And all that's even before we get to questions of enforcement. And yet, most people, when they look at the situation, agree on the types of problems that we face in our dysfunctional system. There are 10 to 12 million illegal aliens living in the law's shadow. I'm reminded of the movie Canadian Bacon, the last one that the late John Candy was in, with the immortal line from this ominous public service announcement. He was an upstate New York cop, and he was doing his best to saw this invasion from the northern border, and he said, "Canadians, they walk among us." Public service. Also, scientists, engineers, researchers, businessmen, all sorts of professionals have no path to a green card. Forget citizenship, no path to a green card, to legal residence, and often not even a path to a work visa, as I'll discuss shortly. There's an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal just this morning about special kind of work visas, and it kind of comes down to a lottery. People graduate with Ivy League educations, graduate degrees and whatnot, and then have to go back because there's a certain cap on basic work visas. That's before you can get to green cards. We educate them and then send them home to India, China, Russia, or they go to Canada, Europe, Australia, Chile, countries that welcome highly educated immigrants. In fact, there's a technological boom going on in Chile. They call it Silicon Valley. That has a little bit of that is reforms in the economy and immigration policy in Chile, but most of it is because of the American immigration system. People go there when they can't stay here, even if there are employers who want to hire them. And employers are unable to find legal and reliable workers of various kinds, from these STEM professionals to manual laborers, despite relatively high levels of unemployment, as Alabama and Georgia found out with their crops rotting in the fields after they put in some state-based reforms to crack down as best states can on illegal aliens. And border states and counties face a disproportionate burden relating to the provision of social services and law enforcement. So even though immigrants, including illegal immigrants, benefit the country as a whole, there are certainly what costs there are certainly disproportionately felt by places that provide social services, hospitals, schools, that sort of thing. But Congress, for various political reasons that, unlike in many other policy areas, cut across party lines, has been unable to fix anything. Regardless of the party in power and whether the president has spent his own political capital to push immigration reform like President Bush did, or not, like President Obama has not. He's more engaged on the executive action side, which I'll get to in a moment. Nothing's been done legislatively. And this de facto benign neglect, not surprisingly, has not been a winning strategy for the country. And so state governments, feeling tremendous pressure from their constituents to address the consequences of the federal failure to fix the nation's immigration laws, acted for themselves. Arizona is kind of the poster child for this, but we've also seen various immigration-related laws passed in states as different as Utah, Georgia, California, Rhode Island, not necessarily trying to become more strict in some ways. There are sanctuary cities. I mean, there's a whole host of ways, seeing that there's nothing coming from Congress, that states are trying as best they can, whether with state-based work permits or enforcement mechanisms or other types of policy innovations. States are reacting, not always without legal problem, to Congress's abdication of its duty to manage our immigration system. Arizona's SB 1070 was in the news, front page news for a while, and ultimately reached the Supreme Court. Exemplifies the crucial distinction between law and policy that both liberals and conservatives tend to forget. A law that's good policy might be unconstitutional or preempted by some higher law, or vice versa. Here we see the converse, exactly. I think that 1070, as well as other laws like E-Verify and the Legal Arizona Workers Act, LAWA, that's been patterned across different states, are mostly constitutional, and the Supreme Court has generally agreed, but they're bad policy. I'll quickly run through the legal issues surrounding United States versus Arizona surrounding SB 1070. It's kind of faded in our rear view a little bit, superseded by gay rights and voting rights and Obamacare again and things like that. But there are some important principles there that I think show a path going forward of what states can and cannot do, and really why the impetus is on the federal government to change here. It's important to remember, first of all, that for all the attention or brouhaha surrounding SB 1070, most of the law went into effect immediately when it was signed in July 2010 and had been in effect for several years by the time it got to the Supreme Court. And the federal government only challenged 6 of its provisions, 4 of which the district court enjoined, and the Ninth Circuit affirmed that, and it went up to the Supreme Court, and 2 others that the federal government accepted the loss on. And it's important to remember the basic legal structure that this case, or that kind of state-federal clashes in immigration fit into. So first, the federal government has exclusive powers over immigration and naturalization, but states have general police powers which can be used for concurrent enforcement of federal immigration law. And for other laws that a lot of people talk about as being immigration-related, but are proper subjects for state regulation, like business licenses or local criminal laws, that sort of thing. And where they clash with federal priorities and federal laws, where you get these court cases. So the district court ruled against the government, and the government didn't appeal, on provisions criminalizing the transportation and harboring of illegal aliens, permitting the impoundment of vehicles used to transport or harbor them. And it left untouched the unchallenged provisions, such as prohibiting any state subdivision from adopting any policy that limits or restricts the enforcement of federal immigration laws less than the full extent permitted by federal law. And another section that required state officials to work with federal officials in this area. States can do these things. They don't have to, but they're constitutionally allowed to do things like that. A section that empowered police to stop vehicles when they reasonably suspect human smuggling, that criminalized stopping to pick up day laborers when it impedes traffic. So you see the general state police power coming in here. This was later enjoined on First Amendment grounds, because there's some issues of, well, are you soliciting? Is that protected speech? These sorts of things. But in terms of the power side, these were not preempted. And other related issues regarding the intentional employment of unauthorized aliens, amending the requirements for checking employment eligibility at the state level. Again, states can do a lot. They have a lot of freedom in this way. And note that racial profiling isn't at issue here. SB 1070 and related laws bent over backwards to make clear that they don't allow, let alone require, any use of race that's not permitted under federal law. There are some uses that are permitted under federal law for national security and for certain other things, which is why the government declined to join kind of the broad-based lawsuit that was brought by the ACLU and La Raza against these laws. Now, the provisions that were enjoined and that were at the heart of the Supreme Court case are generally considered to be the most controversial ones. The show me your papers, please provision, requiring police to check the immigration status of anyone that they lawfully detain, whom they then have reasonable suspicion to believe may be in the country illegally. Making it a state crime to violate federal alien registration laws. So it's already illegal under the federal law, the state made it illegal under state law. Making it a crime for illegal aliens to apply for work or solicit work or work as independent contractors, and permitting warrantless arrests where police have probable cause to believe that a suspect's committed a crime, making them subject to deportation. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about what all the arguments were on these four provisions or how the Supreme Court ruled. The Supreme Court ended up striking down the latter three that I discussed, but upholding unanimously what's been seen as the most controversial one. That's show me your papers, please. The ones that it struck down, it said that Congress had fully occupied the field or fully legislated in areas like alien registration requirements. You can't have further penalties, further requirements on top of those, that was preempted. Or making it a crime to apply for work when you're in the country illegally. Well, Congress had already set out a scheme that they were going to punish employers more than employees, and so this would disrupt that scheme, so that was preempted. I think those are probably correct rulings. The last one, it was kind of a closer call, the one about police arresting for certain cases. That could have gone either way. But the unanimous one that the Supreme Court upheld, you don't really get this in the media, but if the government had won there, and this is why it lost, then essentially any government policy, forgetting the law, any government policy or prosecutorial discretion would be able to trump state law. It would be preemption by executive whim, which we don't allow. As I said, the court rejected 9-0. That is, if what was at issue here was that the federal government didn't like all of these Arizona law enforcement officers calling into the Homeland Security or their authorized agents to verify the immigration status of people that they picked up. And they said, well, this diverts our resources, it's not in line with our enforcement priorities, that sort of thing. Well, those are discretionary policy choices. The law is what the law is, and that sort of law does not conflict with the federal law. And that's why the court upheld it. But a law's constitutionality is, again, not synonymous with its wisdom. As I've said, I think these sorts of laws are an unsurprising reaction to the federal government's failure to both enforce existing law and reform that law in a manner that would make sense for economic, security, and civic interests. But noble, or at least understandable, goals are neither a necessary nor sufficient condition for good public policy. And these sorts of strict state-based immigration controls aren't good policy because they deprive the states of workers that are a net economic benefit to those states. They make law enforcement in immigrant communities more difficult because people are suspicious and don't want to deal with the officers. And it shifts law enforcement resources away from higher value uses, whether those be violent crime, the drug trade, terrorism, or whatever you might prefer, other local priorities. Now, the law's proponents and those who want more stricter enforcement as well at the federal level invoke the negative effects that illegal immigrants allegedly have on our economy by way of taxing federal, state, local social services, welfare system, and engaging in a disproportionate amount of criminal activity. But research on these issues shows that those are myths, essentially. As my colleague Alex Narasti, who's Cato's point man on immigration policy, he's not a lawyer, but he works exclusively on immigration for us. A couple of years ago, he published an influential paper called "The Economic Case Against Arizona's Immigration Laws." And this isn't just SB 1070, it's also LAWA, which acts kind of as a business death penalty if you can't get a license if you employ illegals, that sort of thing. And he showed how they hurt the state economy. And also, E-Verify placed another bureaucratic layer between employers and employees, incentivizing workers to work in the informal economy and forcing others to leave the state. E-Verify is a federal law that's optional that some states have adopted that make you check with the federal government against a database to verify before anyone is allowed to work. And E-Verify opened up holes in the labor market that have yet to be filled still, especially in agriculture, where wages are not very flexible upwards. Arizona's agriculture and construction industries have both seen employment declines far greater than in neighboring New Mexico or California, for example. And the threat of the business death penalty and the uncertainty of raids by state authorities further hurt the economic climate. The unauthorized immigrants, the illegal aliens, who left the state took their businesses and spending power with them, which reduced demand for goods and services, et cetera, et cetera. The residential real estate market was the most affected. Phoenix, the Phoenix metropolitan area, which is home to about 2/3 of Arizona's population, experienced the second greatest decline in home values of any metropolitan area in the country after the housing bubble burst. Arizona's immigration laws drove thousands of renters and homeowners from the state, contributing to that, putting downward pressure on real estate prices in the midst of the housing price collapse. And remember, what do these laws target? Not crime or even drugs. That's a separate discussion about the drug war that I have. Let alone human trafficking, which has also been a big problem through the corridor to Phoenix and Tucson. But businesses trying to grow and people trying to earn an honest living. What's E-Verify? It's a system of asking the government for permission to work. Think about that. And that yields plenty of false positives, so it's kind of an implementation problem as well. But it just seems un-American, asking the government for permission to work. Ultimately, any long-term solution to unauthorized immigration has to come from the federal government and involve more work visas and green cards with fewer restrictions and regulations. States like Arizona face costs in dealing with unauthorized immigration today, mostly because of federal policy that severely restricts legal immigration. Now, moving to the kind of effect that illegal immigrants have on wages. The argument is often made that, well, it's the poorest Americans that suffer from this. Well, my former colleague Dan Griswold, who headed up our trade immigration shop until a few years ago, found in a report a few years ago that even though the number of legal and illegal immigrants in the United States has risen strongly in the last 25 years, the size of the economic underclass has not. By several measures, the number of Americans living on the bottom rungs of the economic ladder, those who presumably most burden the social safety net, though of course illegal aliens can't access most of the benefits of the social safety net, has been in a long-term decline, even as the number of immigrants and illegal immigrants continue to climb. From 1993 to 2007, the number of people living below the poverty line declined by 2 million. And similarly, a 1 million increase in immigrants living in poverty was more than matched by a 3 million drop in native-born Americans under the poverty line. These figures have shifted. I mean, they're a little dated. They're about 4 years old now. There's been some fluctuations with the Great Recession and so forth. But the immigration-related effects holding constant for the overall fluctuations in the economy remain the same. The title of Dan's study, by the way, if you want to look it up, is As Immigrants Move In, Americans Move Up. So it's kind of a dynamic economy. As people take some of the lower-paying, unskilled jobs, that frees up capital and labor to take other kinds of jobs. So stated another way, most studies find that Americans, certain kinds of high school dropouts, especially those with criminal records, and recent immigrants are the only groups in American society to see their wages negatively affected by illegal immigration. And then only very slightly. We're talking 1 to 3%, depending on how you measure it. A National Bureau of Economic Research study estimated that while immigration from 1990 to 2004 reduced the wages of Americans without a high school diploma by 1 to 2%, it's boosted the wages of the more than 90% of American adults with a high school education by much more than that in the long run. And there's an economic study by a couple of Australian economists about American immigration policy that I will commend to you called Restriction or Legalization, Measuring the Economic Benefits of Immigration Reform. It concluded that reducing the number of a policy that would reduce the number of low-skilled immigrants by a third compared to projected levels would reduce U.S. household welfare by about 1%. And it would also reduce capital stock, labor input, and output of goods and services. A Duke University study fairly recently found that a quarter of all American engineering and technology companies launched in the 90s and 2000s had at least one key foreign-born founder as well. What's more, states with higher immigration rates tend to have lower unemployment rates than those with lower rates of immigrants. As Michigan economics professor Mark Perry put it, there's no fixed pie or fixed number of jobs, so there's no way for immigrants to take away jobs from Americans. Immigrants expand the economic pie. In other words, immigration is a boon for native-born Americans up and down the economic ladder. Now, arguments relating to crime rates are of similarly little help to those who would restrict or tighten enforcement. Empirical evidence points to the fact that immigrants, foreign-born Americans, whether they're in the country legally or not, are less likely to commit crimes than native-born Americans, by a significant amount, actually. In testimony before Congress, Rutgers criminologist Ann Morrison Peel concluded that immigrants have much lower institutionalization rates than native-born, on the order of 1/5 the rate of natives. More recently arrived immigrants had the lowest relative institutionalization rates. That is, as they become more assimilated, they tend to adopt more American-style rates of crime. There's no evidence that the immigrant crime rate was lower because of deportation of illegal immigrants who might otherwise be in prison. And indeed, as illegal immigrants were drawn by the boom, the housing construction boom of the 2000s, the rate of violent crimes in both Phoenix and the entire state of Arizona fell by more than 20%, a steeper drop than in the overall U.S. crime rate. Okay, so if those aren't the measures, or if those aren't the concerns that we should be addressing, how should we fix the system? Well, first, bear in mind several things. Enforcement alone won't work, or just legalizing people who are here won't work. That was the problem with the 1986 reform under President Reagan, what's called kind of the big amnesty of the 80s. Some people say, well, that was fine, but we didn't then enforce the enforcement provisions of that reform. We just legalized people, and that was it. That wasn't so much the problem. I mean, enforcement spending, border control, budgets, that sort of thing went up significantly. The problem here, however, was it didn't account for what would happen in the future. That is, it legalized people who are here, started enforcing the border more, but what to do about, the still very serious incentives, economic incentives for people to come from Mexico and Central America and everywhere else in the world, for that matter, to America to work for a better standard of living. The mechanisms for legal immigration for either skilled or unskilled workers were not changed by that reform, and therefore you just, a few years later, the same problems were in existence with people here illegally and stuck in a backlog of applications and things like that. Second principle to understand when thinking about possible reforms. Immigration auto-corrects for the needs of the economy. That is, for the first time in 40 years, when the Great Recession hit in 2008, the immigrant population dropped. It seems like foreign-born people respond to economic incentives just like Americans do. The percentage of foreign-born dropped from 12.6 to 12.5%. This is up from a historic low in America of 4.7% in 1970. So you can see our demographics have changed rapidly and our laws have not kept pace. And this is most pronounced in areas that have been hardest hit by the recession, like Phoenix and Los Angeles. and most hardest hit in the ethnic groups that have higher rates of illegal presence. Mexicans, for example, dropped over 300,000. And immigrants moved to states with higher growth. So they're not attracted by, say, California's more generous welfare state. They're more attracted by Texas's job creation. In terms of winners and losers, non-immigrant, American winners and losers, well, the winners are property and business owners, workers whose work is complementary to the work that would be done by those who are coming from abroad, and consumers. The losers, some low-skilled workers, as I said, some high school dropouts, maybe some high-skilled workers in very isolated areas. There might be pockets of engineers in certain places that aren't as mobile for family reasons or so forth, and there might be challenges, wage pressure there at a small level, and older immigrants themselves can't compete against younger immigrants. On the welfare issue, illegal immigrants, as I said, are not eligible, and even legal immigrants are only eligible after being here for 5 years. The exception is emergency medical care and schooling. Poor immigrants, legal immigrants, are actually less likely to use TANF, Medicaid, or S-CHIP, food stamps, and SSI, Supplemental Social Security, than native-born Americans of the same income level. For immigrants in welfare-receiving households, the average dollar value that they receive is lower than that for natives. At the end of the day, the American welfare state was designed to help the sick, the elderly, single women, while immigrants are mostly healthy young men, so this is not surprising. Welfare for the elderly, in terms of entitlements, Medicare, Social Security, dwarf any sorts of welfare going to immigrants. My colleagues, Dan Griswold, the one who I mentioned before, had a saying that we need to build a wall around the welfare state, not around the country, to solve what problems are there. I also like to joke that with Arizona, they need to build a wall on their western border, not their southern one, so let in the production people. And politically, immigrants become more active when threatened. And this is important for Republican politicians, I suppose, especially with the new Congress. Over time, voting patterns of immigrants track those of Americans based on income and education level. Asians are actually the fastest growing demographic of immigrants in America. And because of some of the xenophobic rhetoric coming from Republican politicians, their share of vote for the GOP has dropped in presidential years from 55% in 1992, remember that was a year that Clinton, the Democrat, won, 55% in 92, to 41% in 2004, 24% in 2012. Slightly higher last week in the midterm election. But anyway, the trends are such. So, what do I advocate? Well, in broad strokes, greatly expand legal opportunities for both temporary and permanent residents, especially for employment-based immigration. That is, create a line to get into, right? That's always the debate. They should get in line like everyone. Well, there is no line. For me, I got my college degree, my law school degree in the United States, clerked for a federal judge, interned in the Senate. All this cool stuff, right? But it's not like I can just apply and say, look, here are my credentials. I speak English well. I can find a job. I'm a displaced. There's no just like application to be made. You have to be. Your employer has to prove to the satisfaction of the Labor Department, not even the Immigration Services, but the Labor Department, that no American has the minimal qualifications for your job. That's an expensive process. Involves a lot of lawyering. Law involves playing lawyer games. You advertise in the newspaper, and then you have to interview everyone that comes. And if you want to reject them, good enough, just saying that the immigrant you want to hire is more qualified than the American is not a good enough reason for rejecting the American. You have to prove that the American is not qualified for the job that you're hiring for. Now, I was a bit of a special case. I had made powerful friends along the way. I had a letter supporting my green card petition from General Petraeus and White House officials and things like this. So I was allowed to go through as an alien of exceptional ability, which meant that my green card petition took the lightning fast time of 18 months. Okay, that's really fast. I mean, the only people that get processed faster than that are like Olympic gold medalists and Nobel Prize laureates. And because of that, my Cato, who was sponsoring me, that's another actually reason why I left Big Law and joined Cato. Not that I needed more reasons, but having paid off my loans and paid for my condo, that'd be something else. But nevertheless, Cato didn't have to advertise in legal newspapers and interview candidates like that. They could just put up the notice on our internal bulletin board and maybe something on the website or something. In any event, I got through, and then 5 years later, that's the hard part, by the way, getting the green card. Once you got the green card, 5 years later, as long as you haven't committed a deportable felony, you're good to go, which I think is backwards as well. I think it should be easier to work here and live here, and harder then to become a citizen, relatively speaking. That's what every other immigrant-accepting country in the world does. All right, so in terms of these temporary and permanent permits, repealing the arbitrary and restrictive H-1B cap, that's for skilled workers. It's a cap of 85,000 that hasn't changed in years and years and years. This year, I think there were 187,000 applications for those 85,000 slots. And it's 65,000 for those with bachelor's degrees. They add another 20,000 for those with graduate degrees. There's been no change since 1990. As the population and the economy grows, except for 3 years during the tech boom of the end 90s, early 2000s. And this causes outsourcing and offshoring. All these kind of nomenclature that comes out during the election campaigns. So-and-so outsourced and offshored and whatever. Well, it's because they couldn't bring in people to do the jobs here, so they had to put the call center in India or what have you. For the unskilled, it's even worse than for the skilled, because there's not even even if your employer wants to hire you, they can't go through the process that I sketched out, or go into a lottery or anything like that. I think that those who are already here illegally should get some sort of temporary parole. I mean, parole is an immigration law term of art already that means something else, but I'm using the word parole in a kind of a lay sense, that they should be allowed to stay as long as they don't commit crimes and pay their taxes and things like that. I call it a parole, not amnesty. They're not forgiven or whatever. They're not given lots of benefits. They're not given an instant green card or an instant citizenship. For that matter, the path to citizenship doesn't even matter. People come here to work for safety reasons, because they want their kids growing up here, that sort of thing. They don't come here to vote, sit on juries, or forever be beholden to the IRS, which are the only things that's different between a green card and citizenship. We should have a temporary worker program for those unskilled who want to come here, for low-skilled labor, and make that visa portable so that they're not exploited by their employers when they come here. And expand the sectors of the economy that are allowed to use migrant laborers. Currently, the agriculture section and certain construction industries are allowed to, but not others. We also, as I said, I'm sort of alluding to this, but we have to refocus our efforts to employment-based immigration, not chain migration. It's often easier to get your second cousin twice removed into the country than it is someone who has useful skills that would be instantly employable. And this isn't some novel pie-in-the-sky sort of reform. In the 50s, we had what was called the Bracero program, whereby 1.8 there were 1.8 million illegals in 1953. They were driven to the border. They stepped one foot in the border, and then they came back with this temporary work permit. And they were allowed to go back and forth for a certain amount of time. Some of it was seasonal work, some of it was more permanent. And this provided a legal pathway that destroyed the incentive for illegal immigration. At that point, the only people who were coming in illegally for those who didn't want to work or had some other ulterior motive for coming. Who killed the Bracero program? Cesar Chavez, the hero of the unions and the so-called hero of the unskilled Hispanic laborers. He was the founder of the United Farm Workers. Lobbied Congress to kill the program because the new migrants were competing with his union members, and the UFW members beat up the people that wanted to come in under the Bracero program. Only after the Bracero program was removed was Cesar Chavez able to organize the Great Grape Strike of 1965 and other actions. And indeed, unions are probably the biggest opponents of legal immigration that we have in this country. Next, I would redirect the resources that we save from kind of these nonsensical enforcement measures that we currently have, from the current restrictionist policies, towards securing the border against terrorists and criminal gangs and those who break laws other than the ones against being in the country illegally. I think this would reduce lots of pressure on law enforcement, and it would increase respect for the rule of law. People wouldn't be living in the shadows. People would see that law enforcement is going after true bad guys. If you have a broad liberal system of legal immigration, then why would someone come in illegally? There must be, it'd be easier to enforce that and less politically rife. Now, of course, as I said, there's been gridlock in Congress on this, as in so many issues. And so President Obama has been threatening to change at least part of this process, the legalizing people who are here illegally without touching the highly skilled or the temporary work program or the other reforms that I proposed. He's already done this for the so-called dreamers, people who were brought to the country illegally as children and raised here and often don't speak the language or don't know the country where their parents are from. And as long as they are still in school or serving in the military, they are under this DACA, Deferred Action program. Now, deferred action is actually part of the immigration laws. The president has tremendous, and the executive branch has tremendous discretionary authority to stay deportations, to decide how to prioritize, which kind of businesses to raid, or going after certain types of criminal, enforcement priorities, deportation priorities, those sorts of things. Or they can defer action on, or what's called parole in place, certain people that they do catch or that come out of the shadows and register with them. And so this has been done historically in various circumstances. After Hurricane Katrina, for example, immigration enforcement was suspended in the states affected by that natural disaster. After 9/11, there are certain times where these kind of enforcement priorities, the use of executive discretion has been used in the way that the law intends. The DREAM Act did not, unfortunately, pass Congress, doing by law the allowing the dreamers, the people brought here as kids, to stay here. And President Obama had said earlier in his first term that America is a nation of laws, which I, as president, am obligated to enforce the law with respect to the notion that I can just suspend deportations through executive order. That's just not the case, because there are laws on the books that Congress has passed. Well, a year later, he changed his mind in the lead up to the election. And there's no bright line on exactly where executive discretion ends in terms of this deferred action or other types of ways that the president can pick and choose or prioritize, or the executive branch can prioritize how to enforce the law. But, say, suspending all immigration laws in the country, or saying everybody in the country illegally now gets a green card or a temporary work permit that's infinitely renewable, that, I think, is on the far side of the line, wherever it is. The president's duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, I think, is violated when the president suspends laws wholesale. Unclear whether the Executive DREAM Act, as it were, is unconstitutional. I do think that if President Obama takes executive action for a much larger class. I think the Dreamers are 400,000 people, something like that. It's not that huge at the end of the day. But if he acts on the 10 or 12 million that are here illegally, that would be problematic. I mean, I don't know why he changed his mind in the first place that this was not constitutional. And indeed, in June of this past year, after much debate within his caucus, Speaker Boehner announced that the House wouldn't bring the immigration bill to a vote that had already passed the Senate. And President Obama, because of that, announced that he'd take more unilateral action. It's more of this tendency that he has to say that when Congress won't act, I will, as if under our Constitution the executive gets more powers when Congress isn't acting. But executive action can't be justified as a means to end gridlock when constitutionally authorized political reforms, such as eliminating the filibuster, reducing gerrymandering, or uniting American popular opinion, can do so instead. There are lots of examples here that you could use for the president not being able to get kind of extra powers as a safety valve, say, when Congress doesn't act. Imagine President George W. Bush, when he was faced with the defeat of the Social Security privatization plan, had simply directed the Treasury to let workers deposit their Social Security taxes into personal accounts. Or a President Romney, if he had decided to indefinitely delay Obamacare implementation because he couldn't overcome a Senate filibuster that blocked repeal. Future President Rand Paul, unable to pass a tax reform, decides not to enforce the corporate income tax, citing prosecutorial discretion. President Hillary Clinton, unsuccessful in convincing Congress to pass welfare reform, decides to waive the requirement that welfare recipients work to receive benefits. President Ted Cruz, in keeping with Obama's decision not to enforce marijuana laws in 2 states, now I guess it might be 4, plus D.C., we'll see what happens on that, decides not to prosecute Texas businesses for violating environmental laws. And President Elizabeth Warren decides that the government would no longer collect interest on federally guaranteed student loans, waiving enforcement against defaulting debtors. These may or may not be good policies, but I don't think it's something the executive can do on his own. The solution to political gridlock is to use politics to end the gridlock, not to redefine the Constitution's separation of powers. And so, at the end of the day, unauthorized immigration and all of the other perversities in our system is an unintended consequence of federal immigration restrictions. Just as the problem started at the federal level with Congress, that's where reform has to come from. Thank you. Happy to take as many questions as you have. Yeah.
I'll take one, and I'm going to bring this up because I think it's sort of the shibboleth that raises the cries of racism. So I think it's something that's not talked about, but it really should be. And that is, I think as a society and in the West in general, we say that diversity is a strength. And in some particular cases, I think that's very true. In general, though, if you take a historical look at diversity in countries, it actually has been the very opposite. It's been a great weakness. If you take the Soviet Union, for example, take the Middle East, Yugoslavia. If we allow these guest workers to come in, 10 million, or legalize them and make them citizens, I think the fear is that it brings this incentive for even more people to come into the system. And if there is no stop to it, you're going to have a large group within the country that is not fully assimilated. And I think already today we have communities that are gated communities. There's already these fractures within our society. And I think that's probably one of the biggest issues people have with making 10 million people citizens and then inviting even more. So I wonder if that was never brought up as an issue in what you talked about. I just wonder if you had any comments.
Well, there's sort of a number of things there. First of all, As I said, it's not a matter of simply making them citizens. Indeed, I don't think there's any reason to, if the political compromise is to say that you're allowed to, those who are here illegally are allowed to stay and work, but you can never become citizens, I think that's probably acceptable. Because again, they're not here because they want citizenship. They're here because they want to work and raise families. Now, their kids should be allowed to become citizens. We don't want to have, third-generation stateless people like the Turks in Germany, which causes radicalism and things like that. I think there should be some sort of, 20-year-long path to citizenship or something like that. But if the political compromise is, those who are here illegally never get citizenship, I think I could live with that. I think they could live with that. The only kind of interest group that can't live with it right now is the Democratic Party, because they want their votes. Notice how I criticized both parties? You see? John being honest. So you raise a number of things. The word diversity doesn't really mean much. What we don't want is to have kind of illiberal systems of thinking brought into the country and propagated, right? We like lots of different cultures. We like lots of different foods. We like, entertainment. I mean, that sort of diversity or flavor is kind of interesting, and America's had it in the past. In fact, the rate of the foreign-born population at the time of the Great Recession, it's gone down a little bit now, but at the time of the Great Recession was just a smidge lower than it was at the height of the Ellis Island days, for example. In that day, people thought, well, no way can we ever assimilate these Eastern Europeans, these Italians, these Poles, the Irish. I mean, come on, these people are very different from Americans. They can never be assimilated. Way back in the day, in the Framers' day, the Germans, these people are very different than the English. The Scots, that came later, settled Appalachia and so forth. Every kind of generation goes through this, and it's not so much a foreigner thing. It's you have to have the culture, and you have to have the strength of national purpose, I guess, belief in America itself. And sure, there are certain currents within America itself, not in foreign-born populations, legal or illegal, but in kind of the postmodern disease that spreads through academia and kind of the heights of the idea industry. That we shouldn't judge different cultures, or that it's racist to, say X, Y, or Z. Kind of heightened sensitivities, even about the word usage, say. When a nation loses its belief in itself, then it can be overrun by illiberal ideas. The reason, Europe is now facing a very different immigration-related challenge from Muslim immigrants than America is from the immigrants that we have. And it's not simply because, those are North Africans and these are or Middle Easterners and these are Latin Americans. It's also because of America still believes in itself more than, Holland or Germany or France. The idea of what the country is for, and that there's some cultural ideal we're saving. Jason Riley, who is a opinion writer for the Wall Street Journal, wrote a book a few years ago called "Let Them In." It's more nuanced than the title suggests, but it kind of goes into the top level arguments for and against immigration. And he says, to address the issue of assimilation and postmodernism and that threat, we should deport the faculty of Columbia, not Colombians. And there's something to that. But I think the engines of assimilation are actually stronger now than they were in Ellis Island days. TV and the internet, and we kind of, it's still possible to live in ethnic enclaves, I suppose, and some older people do. Heck, most of my dad's friends in Toronto are, Russian-speaking Jews. That's just, he's 78. You're not about to make friends with people who have lived completely different lives than you. I'm not as concerned about the immediate illegal immigrants or that would be legalized, that would have work permits. Again, economics drives this situation. People would be allowed to stay or to come if they can find gainful employment. If you lose your job and you can't find another one for a period of 30 days or whatever the statutory requirement would be, then you have to go back. As I said, as the economy ebbs and flows, the influx of people coming here ebbs and flows. And I have no patience for people who are coming here to do something other than work and raise their families and that sort of thing. Instant deportation of criminal drug gangs and human traffickers and things like that. But that's easier to do once you've legalized the people who are there just to make an honest living.
One of the impression, that a lot of countries that have at least seemingly more streamlined process for immigration also have already, for however many years they've been formed, had a language established, national language. And the U.S. obviously doesn't. Do you see that helping or hurting the U.S.? Because I know different politicians have debated on that as well.
I don't think passing a law making English the official language would do anything. I think it's important as a matter of education policy to educate kids in English, the dominant language. I think a lot of kids have been harmed by being kept in bilingual language too long. I mean, I came in at age 4, so and by the time I started kindergarten a year later, I think I already knew English better than the native Canadian kids by just watching Sesame Street, I think. But little kids, obviously, it's not an issue. Although even kindergartners are sometimes put in bilingual education classes. It's no reason, It's really puberty, the point at which language acquisition changes a little bit, but kids are very adaptable and they don't need much of that sort of support. Kind of the attitude by a lot of elites that people don't need to learn English. It's very different from passing laws saying they have to or they'll be denied services if they don't or something like that. But I think it would be healthier if more people recognize that it's nobody needs to give up their native language. That's a richness. You should keep that and pass it on to your kids. But you should, it's a good thing for you to learn English, that you'll be more successful in this country. One thing that does kind of make my head scratch and might call for legislative reform is in voting. They translate the ballots into all these different languages, depending on who lives in which area. And I think it's a kind of a perverse interpretation of the Voting Rights Act combined with legislation passed in the 70s and 80s, kind of to try to be progressive with this sort of thing. But I took the citizenship exam fairly recently. I went through the process, and you have to prove English proficiency. Now, if to become a citizen, which is the qualification you have to have, the only qualification you have to be able to vote. Well, I guess you have to be 18 as well. If to become a citizen you need to show English proficiency, there's no reason to translate ballots into other languages, because ballots are fairly simple. They're like the names of people, occasionally the name of a party or something like that, but that's about it. Maybe ballot propositions, I suppose, but proficiency should be able to understand that. So either our immigration, our naturalization tests need to be tweaked to be more rigorous, or we should stop wasting money and telling people that they can vote without showing that proficiency that they displayed when they naturalized. Yeah.
You mentioned several good solutions for improving the process of immigration, but what specifically could be done to improve the Board of Immigration Appeals?
It's a very technical question. I'm a simple constitutional lawyer. I think problems in the Board of Immigration Appeals are symptoms of the larger issue. I think there's a huge backlog. Judges sometimes are appointed who aren't fully qualified as kind of political patronage. Look, most of the problems is simply because we have a nonsensical system, and it's the criteria that the judges are applying isn't simply would this person be a productive member of society. That's rarely the test that they're supposed to apply. They're using discretion when they have discretion based on just sometimes contradictory factors, and in different parts of the country, similar cases come out differently. I don't know the very specifics at the local level, if there are particular problems here or wherever immigration cases from North Carolina go. But I think really the substantial solution, rather than just kind of patchwork, is to fix the larger problem. Yeah.
So you mentioned that we're going to need to use politics to kind of stop this gridlock, and I absolutely agree. But from my perception, it seems to me that the gridlock is somewhat self-perpetuating, in that now that, particularly now that Republicans have taken control of Congress fully, there is a perception among particularly the conservative base that any mention of reform is synonymous with amnesty. So I think it's going to be critical to change the dialogue, but to get reform on the table. How would you suggest that could be accomplished?
Leaders have to lead. They have to educate their constituents. And they're also, this is an issue I think that has to be a Nixon to China moment, by which I mean nothing's going to happen under Obama because nobody trusts Obama, even less than they like him. And, George W. Bush came very close. I think some of the reform plans there weren't fully formed, and there were, it might take something like the 1986 tax reform, where the leaders from both parties in the House and the Senate got together behind closed doors. Now you'd have to have them leave their iPhones and BlackBerries outside as well, and just hammer something out. And that what comes out of that room has to be it goes for an up or down vote. And the president, it would have to be a Republican president, would have to lead. Certainly, if Jeb Bush is elected, it would be a priority. I can see a Scott Walker who likes to reform and find solutions to complicated problems, might be able to tackle it. Ted Cruz is no dummy. He says a lot of what he says for political positioning and so forth. Don't laugh, but if Ted Cruz is elected, which I think is less likely than the couple other people I mentioned, I think he might be tackling it. He would be in a trusted position, and he sees the perversities in our current system. You might end up with a different sort of solution, at the margins, but it's going to take something like that. You're right. The gridlock is in popular opinion, in a large part, and it's not. I wouldn't say so much it's Republican versus Democrat. It's almost opinions on immigration sort of break more along education and employment and income lines than they do on party lines. Yeah.
This is more of a rhetorical question. I think you just kind of answered it with feedback on our question as well, but is the problem really immigration reform itself, the politics? I mean, obviously that's a big problem, but is the bigger problem the average American not really understanding basic economic reasoning and applying that to immigration? And I'm not trying to be cynical when I say this, but when you have shows like South Park saying, they took our jobs, all these people saying, you see Hispanics working on construction sites and making jokes about it, but the sad reality is that is how a lot of people think about it. And, they apply that same mentality to a lot of other economic problems, and, I feel like you can change the politics all you want, and yes, you are correct. Obviously, leaders, you have to lead and educate, but it only goes so far. I mean, is it really just a homegrown problem of people don't have the capability or capacity or courage to really look at these problems and take the emotional
It's a
side out
difficult
of it?
issue because most Americans, 95% of Americans will never encounter the immigration system. Obviously they themselves won't have to go through it, but they won't even necessarily have relatives or what have you. That is difficult. by the way, I take it you're not running for office, but you're saying American voters just don't get it. Yeah, I mean, that's partly why this is such a difficult problem, because unlike, even though we have gridlock on lots of issues, tax reform, entitlement reform, you name it, there at least people, understand a little bit more, even if they don't understand the economics any more than they do in this. At least they, have a grasp of what's, there's demagoguery on both sides. One side yells racism, the other side yells amnesty, and both are wildly incorrect. It's going to take real leadership, and it's going to, it's not easy. But our current immigration system really harms the country in all the ways that I described. And I imagine a Republican president or a Democratic president who is not tied to Obama might be able to make some headway. But it's, I'm not saying it's, here's the magic. I'm not a politician. I don't know if professional politicians exactly have a great roadmap, but that's what it would look like.
I think we have time for one more question. Another event, right?
I think that's right. That's sort of the way life goes here.
I know, Lance, you had your hand up a few times. Okay.
Going back to a system like what we mentioned back in the 50s, we had migrant workers, of course, coming from America for a century or more. But now we have, for lack of a better term, basically drug law. How is that violence and things will affect the immigration system if we were to return to a system like that?
Well, people who engage in violent crimes should be deported if they're here as immigrants. I have a problem with the drug war itself. That's a whole other issue. I don't think we need to, fix the drug war in order to fix immigration necessarily, although that would help. I think it would be easier to tackle criminal drug gangs, violent drug gangs, if those were specifically the sorts of people, that couldn't blend in with other immigrant populations. You knew that if you're not working at a job, if you don't have a visa, well, then you must be here for some other reason. So I think it would be easier to, those sorts of priorities would be easier to pursue if we fix